Contrast Security secures the code that global business relies on. It is the industry's most modern and comprehensive code security platform, removing security roadblock inefficiencies and empowering enterprise developers to write and release secure application code faster. The Contrast platform automatically detects vulnerabilities while developers write code, eliminates false positives, and provides how-to-fix guidance for easy and fast vulnerability remediation. Learn more about the Contrast platform at securityweekly.com/contrast security. Your organization is building and updating business-critical web applications faster than ever. And with so much pressure to move fast, you may find yourself making trade-offs between innovation and security. Now you can build fast without sacrificing security with Invicti, the application security platform that helps your dev, sec, and ops teams work together to secure every website, web app, and API. With unparalleled accuracy, coverage, and automation, Invicti scales like no other AppSec solution. Discover why many of the world's largest organizations innovate securely with Invicti. Visit securityweekly.com/Invicti. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Larry Maccheroni from Contrast Security about the importance of functional testing as a way to build confidence in releasing software quickly in response to 0 days. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella, and now officially we've got Joe South lined up. This is our new segment, and we've got two announcements for you. One, do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions at securityweekly.com/guests. We review suggestions monthly and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. Plus, don't forget to check out our library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings at securityweekly.com/on-demand. And you've heard that a dozen times, so you all know where to go and find our webcast and technical training. Just as you know that this is the segue into the news stories of the week. John and Joe, we've got quite a slew of them. But Joe, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to read through them yet, but want to just also take a quick moment to say hi. And as we read news items, there's certain areas that I think our listeners know that John likes to pick up on, certain areas that they know I like to pick on. But I'm curious, what are some areas that you tend to look for, some areas that appeal to you most when we get into news articles? And here I'm just not necessarily for this episode, but just in general as we bring them around.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, what catches my eye more than anything is probably anything with cloud security, military, federal agencies, and probably even some malware as well.
Ooh, excellent. So someone has been reading ahead on the list of articles. We have this because I think we hit all three of them. But first, John, I pulled up one for you. Just a quick follow-up about the Honda and the rolling pwn. They have an updated article saying that they are going to fix some current and future models to address this issue. I don't know that there's too much to add here. You know, we're talking about, other than my question is always, how current does current mean? Is that just 2022 models or a little bit older? But I'm not sure if there's anything you want to maybe add there, or take us on to some interesting articles that you've got for this week.
Oh boy, the pressure. So yeah, on this one, it's I think really the last 2 or 3 paragraphs of the article are what it comes down to is the ability to, for all car manufacturers moving forward as we go towards more and more, computers in the car. I can't remember the spec on the Tesla. It's I think it's 100 CPUs. As we go towards this shift of having not just a computer in the car, but so many computers in the car, we have to be able to do over-the-air updates. Or worst case, when you go into a dealership, they need to be able to plug something in and preferably over the air, but one way or another, it has to be updatable. And when Honda had their statement around this beginning of the year, there was a lot of feet dragging going on because they didn't want to have a recall and have all the cars come in. I get it. But now they're saying, yes, they're going to do better and try to improve. There's a tiny bit of a hint in this article that there might not just be Honda being affected here. But I think it's, from our point of view, AppSec Weekly, it's, okay, we've identified a problem, we've identified the attack, we've identified the vulnerability. What are we going to do about actually making sure this gets, updated? Larry, in the last segment, was talking about a very interesting idea that customers, depending on some of the binaries they get from their vendors, they might want to run them through a vulnerability scanner. pick your flavor, right? Some sort of a way to generate an SBOM off a binary to see what's going on in there. I hope the average car owner doesn't have to go and start scanning their car, because that's well, that would be an interesting avenue of vendors to start up. I think that the customer segment that's going to go for that is pretty small. Let's see. Let's go to another sort of catch up. Well, this isn't quite a catch up, but how about the HackerOne story, Mike? This came out a few weeks ago. I don't think we've covered it yet. We talk a lot about bug bounty programs and HackerOne, some of these larger firms out there. It turns out one of the folks at H1 was sort of playing both sides of the coin. So they were actually going and taking vulnerabilities which had been discovered for existing HackerOne customers and turning around and selling them on the black market before they had been fully mitigated. So then this customer would get someone coming to him angrily saying, hey, we found a vulnerability in your platform. You need to pay us. Surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, it was surprising to me the speed with which HackerOne recognized this, hopped on it, did an investigation, chopped the whole thing down. So they wasted no time. It seems my sense was they had a pre-existing plan in place and how to deal with an incident response plan, but specifically for a rogue employee. So they hopped into this pretty quickly and took care of it. Keep the name in good place. So it's interesting to see, but it looks like it wasn't that big a deal.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I did like the spirit of transparency around it. We have the article you linked to as well, but HackerOne was pretty clear about what happened, what their response was, and so just highlighting transparency around when bad things happen, it is good to see. And we'll continue to highlight and favorably push on that throughout the industry, I think. There is a lot of, so speaking of, there's another that isn't fully an insider threat perhaps, or maybe it is fair to say that HackerOne article is a good example of insider threat or just the misuse of the platform. There was another article I pulled in that wanted to only touch on one particular aspect of it. This is from a MIT technology review about the U.S. military creating, there was a good phrase, it's called the social cyber program, which is more about who is contributing to open source projects, who is contributing to the Linux kernel, and this is more about the insider threat aspect, or how worried should we be about contributors subtly introducing malicious commits over time, and could that be detected? So there are some other areas about this type of research that the article highlights. One is just looking to find what open source software, especially critical ones, measured in popularity, how much is being used, are underinvested, and that speaks to a lot of the OpenSSF articles we've talked about in the past. So pretty simple article from that perspective, but this was the fun part I wanted to pull out. It's talking about the bus factor. What if somebody gets hit by the bus and there's only, 2 people maintaining Log4j, for example? I just wanted to propose, why make, public transport the villain here? Why don't we talk about something more exciting than the bus factor? Be like, what if somebody's brain gets eaten by a mind flare? Then what do you do with your project? So that's the biggest I wanted to add here, which I know is very insightful AppSec commentary.
So I know you were concerned about where did this whole get hit by a bus thing come from, So I did a little bit of research, and the earliest founding of this was mid 20th century. It started off with a 1907 novel by Joseph Conrad, The Secret Agent. But just to try to understand that it was pure accident, as much as an accident as if he had been run over by a bus while crossing the street. And then it started getting a little more popular in the 30s and 40s and 50s. But yeah, so it's been around for about 100 years. So I'm with you towards moving towards mind flares or mind flames and anything else to, maybe the brain suckers and something other than the poor old automobile.
Yes. Well, let's rather than draining the brains of our audience on those aspects, let's jump over to some cloud-oriented vulns for a moment. And this might get Joe to perk up a little bit. There was an article I came across on Portswigger pointing to a wonderful blog post that I really liked, because the researcher set up a vulnerability found in the AWS IAM authenticator for Kubernetes in EKS flavor. Malware on AWS. But it's really nice in the type of article to read through to say, what is EKS and IAM? Why is it consequential? What was the vulnerability, and how was it fixed? And to jump ahead a little bit, this is the type of vulnerability that I love. It comes down to a one-line commit that was basically lowercasing the word action. So in a series of URL parameters, you could uppercase the word action and lowercase it, and then depending on the somewhat random order of operations that would process those URL parameters, you could potentially bypass some IAM, some authentication capabilities, which is just a wonderful type of flaw that I wanted to highlight because fun vulnerability. But one of those things, as we talk about perhaps functional testing as well as code, manual code review, looking at uppercase, lowercase, the casing of data often could be something that the humans might just gloss over, and but here clearly it's the idea of you should normalize your data first before you start applying any security boundaries. So that was the part that appealed to me. But Joe, I'm not sure how much you've been able to take a look at this. Are there any fun parts of this that really speak to you in terms of the AWS IAM Kubernetes, or just the fun exploit?
I haven't researched the exploit itself very much yet. But I think it really highlights a point that you can't really rely on the cloud provider necessarily to secure your infrastructure and your data, right? So you need to take ownership as a cloud customer of your own data and ensure that it's secured at all times. And the best way to do that is through encryption. Right. So even if, this issue comes up and it's not patched, it's a 0-day that's being exploited in the wild that no one knows about, your data is at least still secure, even if it's breached.
Yeah, I think that speaks to definitely the ideas of application layer encryption rather than just relying on the, call it shared responsibility, or maybe in this case, the shared fate of flaws within the cloud. And I haven't actually gone and checked over in our Cloud Vulns DB, but we talked about that last week, John. One of a topic that I think is favorable for you, and whether or not this showed up there. But I think this would be one of those examples of just to say, do I need to fix this, or does Amazon need to fix this, for example, and just saying what's my window of exposure, which in this case, I think it dates back to 2017. So pretty interesting just to see flaws that are so simple, a one-line flaw, linger for so long.
That's a great point. I hadn't done it. It is in there, but it's dated May 25th.
Oh, that may be with the initial. Yeah, if you look at the that was when it was first reported to AWS. I think it's just been disclosed recently.
Okay, got it. Because we're usually a little more on top of the news than that. Yeah, it is there. That's a good point. I do need to. I have been Googling CVEs this morning for some of our other stories, but I hadn't actually looked into this one, so we need to add this to our little part of our mind of things we go and look and see what's going on out there. I guess it doesn't really have... I'm just looking through an article on, for those playing along at home, cloudvulndb.org. So they track it to a CVE, but it looks like they don't have their own identifier yet. They mentioned that Amazon's got their own codes too. Is that just a blog post? No, it's bulletin. So it looks like I thought they were working on a general overall identifier. So this is sort of a good little bit of homework for us to do and sort of get a sense for how these things work. And my JavaScript is turned off, so I might be missing something in here. But yeah, something for us to keep on top of.
Indeed. I think there is, let's switch and talk a little bit about some engineering. Now, there's a broad engineering article that I wanted to get to, but there's also a very interesting, don't roll your own, but just in this case, go ahead and roll your own from a learning perspective. So you're laughing, John. I think you know what I'm setting up here.
Yeah. So this was, so I found this article originally, I think, on hackaday.io. And initially, it scared me, as you can hear through the stutter, because I think that the short version of the title, when you see it, is rolling your own crypto, everything you need to build AES from scratch. And I'm like, oh no, we don't want people doing that. And then the parenthetical subtitle is, and then never use it for anything of consequence. Yes. Which made me cheer and go, hey, I'm going to click on that and read. And it's actually sort of a fun, fun is crypto, as I know this. I'm usually not one finding the story. But I think it is sort of a fun with pictures, sort of goes through and talks about how does this piece do what it does. I don't think I personally realized in AES that there's a substitution table going on in there. And then goes through and sort of walks through how it goes forward, backwards, does a thing for encryption and decryption, a little bit going into the math. But, you can gloss over that and still get a good sense for what's going on. So I think, the more we know about some of these nitty gritty things going on underneath the hood, the better understanding we have. And I don't expect someone to do this for every crypto algorithm out there, right? I've done this before for RSA. But if you understand how some of these work at a low level, you're able to at least have a sense when you see something new come along of like, hey, should I be doing that or should I not be doing that? Or is there a question I need to be asking about what are the defaults? Is it secure by default, or do I need to replace that? Some people are actually replacing that that substitution table I mentioned. They're like, oh, there's a chance that the guys who created it might have had a bit of weakness in there, so I'm going to use my own because I can do it better. But a week ago I had no idea that thing existed, right? So I think there is definitely value to giving a scan over these and taking a look at it. So I think from that point of view, next Saturday I expect everyone to be grabbing a cup of coffee and sitting down with their favorite IDE and hey, let's write some AES code.
It's fun, and I'm laughing about this, but for me, I did some of my own just kind of AES hashing, and I was trying to learn the C++ Boost Spirit library, which is if you thought C++ was archaic or arcane, try checking out Boost Spirit. But it was a fun way to play around with S boxes and learn some of the. For me, what stood out was, and I appreciated more, was the modes and the importance and sensitivity of the initialization vector. So it's just a good way of hands-on type of learning about encryption. And of course, to repeat, not to be used in production in any way, which, Joe, if we were to use some in production, this a little bit ties into your comment there about the cloud and encryption. What are some of the better things that you would point our listeners to rather than the code that John or I might be writing about AES encryption here?
Well, not doing it yourself is a start. That's probably the worst idea. But, really, it just focuses on using the best encryption, for your use case, right? So that might be Blowfish, right? For instance, for a different use case. If we're talking about a database, we're not going to encrypt the entire database. That's really bad for performance. You would be working on encrypting, columns, rows, or even just different fields.
Yeah, I think that's what gets into, we'll have to find, this will be homework for me, find a good reference on envelope encryption, which I think is, that's synonymous with the app layer encryption I was talking about earlier, which is more a way of having the responsibility for encrypting the data and managing access to it based on a chain of key encryption keys, data encryption keys, and so on. And rather than paint myself into a corner with getting too deep onto areas that I need to refresh my knowledge on, let's switch to another article. This one from about SOC 2 with a fun title of "The Screenshots Will Continue Until Security Improves," which to give it a little bit of setup, you can, some of the listeners may think SOC 2, we'll put our cynical hats on and think, that's compliance. It doesn't mean security. Everybody just asks for it, but it's just an exercise in spreadsheets. That doesn't have to be the case. And I do like to find the aspects of, especially a topic like this, to say, what could we do to take advantage of work that's not just busy work, but that leads into some engineering changes, or at least gives us a roadmap or some references for what we should do to design a secure system so we can meet that SOC 2 or ISO 27001 or other type of compliance framework. And for me, this article goes through a couple of nice high-level SDLC practices, basically talking about protected branches, centralized logging, talking about AWS so far, turn on CloudTrail, using infrastructure as code. They mentioned Terraform, of course. I like that, but these are all, I think, an article that lays out some pretty good, especially it even says some boring stuff, but are good engineering practices. So I'm not sure, John and Joe, how you thought about this when you first thought Mike pulled in a article about compliance.
Well, this is my day-to-day life right now. So I'm trying not to be trolled by this post. I have respect for the person who wrote it. I think I think the tone which it comes across is quite good, and I've actually tried writing something like this recently. Not quite on the same thing, but this is probably one of the driest topics in security, to use a broad umbrella of security beside the crypto stuff. We're hitting all the fun ones today. Sorry, listeners. But I think, and like I said, I've passed this around internally, and I won't say what my comment was, but there's some good points in here. There's some good stuff, but at the same time, it feels like it could have been, I don't want to say edited, but like it feels like it wasn't written with a singular voice. One example coming to mind is near the top, somebody's talking about like the SOC 2. Well, so one is it's written from a very US point of view. Thank you for just mentioning ISO and other things. Outside the US, SOC 2 is there, but it's not that popular. Australia, yes. US, yes. A little bit in Europe, but otherwise ISO. And you've got the essentially in Australia. You've got like other ones in Singapore. There's more specs out there you can throw a stick at. But he made a comment about SOC 2 will let you know if your customer support staff are able to pop your production boxes and get a shell, but it won't tell you if a penetration tester was. And then he goes on to talk about, sort of secure coding practices in SDLC, which basically the result of those is to make sure that that attacker can't pop. So it's a little mixed, like things like that. I think the overall purpose of the article is good and what he's getting across is good. So I don't know. I think it's a starting point for people, but I think, one of the things we've seen with any of these is just getting people to dip their toe in the water and realize it's not as bad as it seems. So I think, if someone reads this and realizes, it is a bunch of, snapshots and screenshots and stuff like that, and there's ways to simplify it, and here's some tricks and here's some things to do. And he makes another point in there about you don't really have to get SOC 2. Good luck with that, dude. If you're going up to like a large enterprise like IBM and their purchasing department says, we need to see your ISO or your SOC cert, that's a big red stop sign. You're just not getting by it. So it's interesting. I think it's a good start. I think it gives someone things to think about, but I wouldn't take it for 100% gospel. And I'll shut up at that point.
No, that's a fair point. I think that I strongly agree with that takeaway in the sense that you must be this tall to ride, in the sense of everyone's going to be asking for SOC 2. Any of your customers are going to be asking for that SOC 2, some type of security certification, because it does at least serve as a proxy for a degree of maturity, in the sense that you had a process in place at one point that you were able to generate this and conceivably have a process for how you're building software. And that's more of what I think appeals to me from that article.
And let me throw one more point in there, because I think it's something it was one of our aha moments. And he mentions it lightly, and when do you do this? But really, the sort of the voice I like speaking to, with whether it's any of these right now, is you don't get, at least for the small to mid-sized company, no one's getting a compliance certification and going through those painful audits, which they can be, for the sake of getting that certificate to throw up on the wall, right? It's a sales tool. So that's really the point of view I think to really focus on these, is like, at some point, if you're a small to mid-sized business, we've got governments around the world which are requiring more and more certifications. So if you can actually realize that if I get this, or either if I get this, I'm going to make more sales, or this thing is blocking me from getting a sale. How quick can I get it done? That's sort of the 2 points of view, I think, to get into these type of things for the smaller companies. The larger ones, that take them a little more seriously, and we can spend another, we used to have a podcast on this, but yeah, I don't know. Again, I'll shut up. It's a good starting point for people. Always happy to talk about it.
Well, I mean, here's the article that I'm going to segue to next, where I'm possibly also going to shut up on. There is the Cyber Safety Review Board had their delivered their first report, which I think is a very good report. So I don't want to have any implications there. The part is just that it's about Log4j. So we talked about that, good conversation with Larry. And the report itself, if you read the executive summary, I think it's good because it basically calls out, what does it say? There's organizations need to have mature processes, speaking of something like SOC 2, to manage assets, assess risk, and mobilize their organization and key partners to action. Most modern security frameworks call out these capabilities as best practices. And I'm using, radio voice just because there's nothing necessarily new here. At least to us, because we've been covering a lot of these types of articles for a long time. But if you are trying to get traction and need some of that external support and references, this CSRB report can be one of those good potential motivators. And I will say, it is a wonderful timeline of Log4j. So if you haven't gotten tired of that topic yet, good information there. But read the exec summary, skip to the recommendations, and even if you don't think Log4j is interesting to you or applies to you anymore. Another thing about things that might or might not apply to you, and I'm trying to do quick here because I want to get to two other articles, Retbleed. We have a new speculative execution attack, which I think is interesting, but possibly interesting in more of an academic sense. And here I want to just kind of pull in the idea of how worried should we be? Think of this as the threat modeling exercise now, because the researchers pointing out that retpolines, which is a nice portmanteau of trampolines and basically the return functions that way back in 2018 were this retpoline was introduced as a mitigation for a speculative attack against CPUs. But now in 2022, researchers have pointed out, it looks like Retbleed has a way for us on certain CPU using architectures to take advantage and bypass that particular countermeasure. So attacks get better over time. Researchers are smart, but not everyone in the world, I think, needs to worry about this. They need to worry about, do you have your asset inventory? Do you have some way of doing software composition analysis? Do you have some functional testing so that you can update your point versions of all of your dependencies, as they come over time? So that's where my mind goes, unfortunately, when I read an article like that. I don't know, John, Joe, if there's something else that speaks to you from this particular one.
I think from my point of view, I'll go first. I was looking this morning. So Linux actually has a workaround for this already. It's in RC5, so it should be released in the next week or two. But what was interesting to me, I was trying to track down the code so we could talk about it on air to see how did they actually mitigate this. Because let's first let me answer your question completely with you. Go and figure out like your list of what assets you have first that you need to deal with, and then we can talk about something like this. But just purely from the AppSec geekery point of view, the one thing that did catch my eye when I was going through is I remember when I was looking at this last week that they said the mitigations could be fairly high CPU-wise. In other words, the overhead which you have to do to deal with this. So it looks like what Linux is doing is they're putting in a bootloader switch to allow you to turn this type of thing on or off, which is interesting, right? It's then I mean you're able to if it's a bootloader flag, it can probably be done at compile time too. So it's interesting that they're doing it in such a way that for those who want to, they can sort of push out of the way and keep their computes doing computing, not protecting against this type of thing.
Keep your computes doing computing. That's going to have to be our new ASW tagline. I love it. And yes, it's a good point too that LLVM, GCC, this is also an area where your compiler can actually be your friend. Obviously, there's a performance impact there, but I think this speaks to Joe. You mentioned, the cloud and the shared responsibility. This is the type of vulnerability that I think the threat models are more interesting to anyone running, with multi-tenancy, anyone running, multiple VMs across CPUs, because that's where the potentially this becomes a little bit more of a threat. Not sure if there's anything you want to add to that aspect of this of that threat model, Joe.
Yeah, I think that this is an interesting vulnerability. It's one that's not very often thought of in the cloud. And it's when, there's a vulnerability that's utilizing more CPU than it should be. So you're spending more money in the cloud than you should be or than you're used to. And, that will affect everyone differently. There's that component of it being shared resources and whatnot. But I mean, there's also that factor of, hey, now I'm about to spend maybe $100K more, maybe, more money in some way for resources that we didn't even know were vulnerable and using a lot more CPU power than they should have been.
Yes, I suppose it's nice to see that we have a much better metric around security, but it might just be more unfortunate that metric is very directly how much money am I spending in my cloud compute resources. And so there was a little bit of threat modeling aspect there. And the reason I wanted to bring that in is that last episode, I mentioned my favorite movie, Tron, Fight for the Users. And I think one of the things I would be remiss on, is if we didn't pull in some more articles about threat modeling and application security that does impact users. We did last episode talk about Apple's lockdown mode, which is good. And here I pulled in another article that 2 sentences in it. Mobile apps are a privacy nightmare. I think that's nightmare, may be strong, depending on your point of view, but privacy in mobile, privacy on web, these are known issues that both mobile vendors, browser developers are working on, and there's a tension there. But the second sentence of this article title is "The Roe decision put them center stage," and this suddenly brings into even potential criminal consequences for the type of for the consequences that can come from data leaks, data collection, and how it's used, perhaps misused, how it's handled. And these, to me, speak to an important aspect of application security threat modeling that includes users. It touches on also privacy, which has different requirements than just pure AppSec does, as well as even having, call it trust and safety teams at many organizations. How does an app's features or lack of features impact users? So wanted to make sure I brought in this article, threw some resources in there, just so that we don't forget to talk about users. And I think I think this is something we can also talk about more of. I know we're running at the end of the episode right now, but let me pause there to see Joe and John, are there something you want to add here, some other resources or ways to think about this from threat modeling with the user-centric point of view?
I'll say for me, from a software vendor at the moment, there's always a pull and push, right? I want to know what my users are using on my platform. I want to know, what should I be putting more development into? Is there a page they don't like? So there's, I'm just looking at purely from either a product owner or CTO or whatever, how you want to call it. I've got this thing I built. I want more people to use it. So I get more funding. So I build more. So I get more users. That's the same stupid cycle. But at the same time, privacy is so huge, and we've taught about it so little worldwide. I think that's I'd almost be quite pointed on it right there, Mike, and say not just so much that, to do threat modeling for users, but threat modeling for a user's privacy. And, wherever you fall in this, you might be like, oh, let's leave the legality of this particular thing out of it. Whether it's this or license plate scanners or Wi-Fi at your house, or, we talked before about the Amazon Sidewalk stuff, or any of these things out there that are doing some amount of information gathering for whatever reason, at some point, one of those is going to piss you off. So you can pick your poison, which battle you want to get behind, but at some point, one of them is going to be, wow, that's doing what to me? So then the question comes back and goes, okay, what's reasonable? How do we handle that data in a safe way? Do we need to anonymize it? Do we need to do some sort of randomization of the data or tokenization, or what do we need to do to get it to a point where, not just thinking about the user, but how would I be if I was on the other side of that fence and my application was collecting that data about me? So in some cases, it's a very small risk, which isn't really going to have, okay, someone found my TikTok, yay. But at the same time, someone found that I was at, this location when I told someone I was somewhere else, or, someone found out something about me that I generally want made public, or there's all sorts of different ways this can be done. And that's, I think, something which is we really need to think about is how do we do that balance between those two aspects? And to bring it really back to AppSec, some of these tools out there right now are AppSec tools, right? If you think about, I'm not picking on anyone, names just coming to the top of my head, New Relic, or X-Ray for Amazon, or a lot of these sort of, APMs that are gathering data about how the application is performing. Okay, well, that application was on your phone, you were using it, that now ends up in someone's database and someone subpoenas that. What do you do with that? So it's not just affecting purely from what we're tracking or what we're collecting from our customers. It's like that application that we want to be able to do with performance or security data could also be caught in this loop. So it's definitely worth a think.
It is, and another example of that AppSec angle is that there's also the worry about bots, fraud, and there's a tension there between how much data can I collect about the device that's visiting me, especially about a trackable device ID, so that I can figure out this is a legitimate user or this is a potential bot user. There was the recent, I can't remember how deeply we covered it. We might have to dust this off and come back. Apple, speaking of Apple, also announced what was the RFC, a standard called Privacy Pass, working with vendors like Cloudflare, Fastly, in order to set up a way of saying, here is a device attestation that Apple has a lot of can inspect a device on, but they want to do it in a privacy preserving way so that they can just attest to like a CDN and say, we believe that this is, a trusted device. We attest to this. Here is our indicator of this, and the CDN can say, okay, cool. And rather than track, this is Mike visiting this set of sites over time, just this is a user that is trusted. We won't put them into the bot workflow and slow them down. So there are definitely some AppSec an AppSec overlap is what I'm trying to say with a lot of this.
Yeah, I'll just briefly, we've had this one on our to cover list for I think about 3 weeks now. So one of these weeks we'll actually give it some due time. But I don't know, Joe, if you have any thoughts on this whole thing.
Yeah, it's it presents an interesting issue, and I'm kind of like eagerly waiting for a comprehensive, privacy act in America, something like GDPR for the UK. I feel like we really need it, and it's an area that we're definitely lacking in, that we could be stronger in.
And unfortunately, we're also lacking in time for the rest of this episode. So, Joe, you got the leave us with the final note there about GDPR, privacy, and a good topic that we'll be revisiting over the next couple episodes. But I want to say thank you to Joe for adding that. Thank you to John, of course, as well. Thank you to all of our listeners. Thanks for joining us. Please do subscribe, hit that like button, check out our show notes. And speaking of running, all you Kate Bush fans that are running up that hill, make sure you've also checked out Babushka and Wuthering Heights. There's an excellent deep discography there. We'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.